So, the focus of the second half of this lecture is about the specific effects of climate change in Antarctica. In lecture 15, we talked a fair bit about global climate change, the science of greenhouse gas emissions, and worldwide what is happening. And this part of the lecture will talk about what changes we see in Antarctica in particular. And it's possible to contemplate a future in which more of Antarctica could look like this, in which there's more bare rock. Now, it's not likely that the entirety of the Antarctic ice sheets are going to melt immediately, but we are seeing some worrying trends, and especially with the outflow of fossil fuels going on unabated, there is the potential for a lot more damage to occur. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention again that reading assignment number 2 is open, and hopefully by this point in the course, you've come across some topics that interest you and that you might be interested in reading about the research that's being done on them. And assignment number 2 is about writing about an article that's actually been published by scientists or social scientists or historians doing research themselves. And the assignment is another 400-word write-up in which you need to address 3 points. For the article you pick, you need to write about what the research goals of the authors were, what their results were, and why those results are important, as well as whether the results are what the authors were expecting. And also make sure that you include a link to the article. And if you are struggling to find, if you don't know what to look for, I've labeled some of the articles that I've assigned you as this would be a good choice for assignment number 2. Or at least that's an example of what type of thing you're looking for, as opposed to a news write-up from The Guardian or from the South China Post or whatever. And the great thing is that as UCSB students, you have access to the research databases that UCSB subscribes to. If you go to the UCSB library website, you can search the databases and find geology articles in GeoRef, or you can find other databases that more closely relate to biology or climatology, or you can simply use the library search function for articles on penguins or articles on glacial retreat or articles on Mount Erebus or whatever else is interesting to you. Whatever article you pick has to have substantial relevance to Antarctica. I'm okay with you picking a history or social science related article, but we need to see what the connection is. And if you don't know for sure what to write about, I'm happy to recommend some articles for you if you email me with some ideas of what you're interested in. And I'm also happy to look at articles that you might have come across to let you know whether I think something is a good fit or not. So this is due on Sunday, May 30th at 11:59 p.m. That is a week after lecture quiz number 2 is due, and it is the Sunday before Dead Week. As for lecture quiz number 2, it is on lectures 11 through 14, so on glaciers and the history of Antarctica. It is due this Sunday, and if you weren't able to attend the review session that I hosted today on Wednesday, May 19th, the slides for that are uploaded and the recordings for that are also uploaded. So I recommend taking a look at that for some example questions and for an idea of the scope of what the quiz actually covers. Again, there will be 10 true or false and multiple choice questions, and then 2 short answer questions that the TAs will grade. You have 30 minutes to take it, and you have 1 attempt to do it. And again, the lecture quizzes are a good checkpoint between sort of midway between lecture quiz number 1 was midway between the start of the class and the midterm. Lecture quiz number 2 is about halfway between the midterm and the final. And we only have a few more weeks after this and not much new material to cover, but this is kind of a good way to see if you feel like you're getting a good handle on the material before the final comes around. And I'll start talking more about the format of the final next week. Lastly, I also wanted to address lab number 7, which is related to material that we covered heavily in class last week when I went over the history of Antarctica. And lectures 13 and 14 are worth reviewing because some of the Captain Cook, who is one of the historical figures that you see talked about in Lab 7, is discussed there. And then the various heroic age figures like Shackleton and Amundsen are discussed in Lecture 14. I also suggest taking a look again at Lecture 2 on geography because that covers latitude and longitude and the Antarctic Circle and map projections and topography and some other concepts that might be good to refresh yourself on before going through Lab 7. I also highly suggest checking out the presentation the TAs have put together for Lab 7 and going back to their description of latitude and longitude that they put together for the Lab 1 handout. So again, there's a lot of useful material, and I'm always happy to answer questions, and then the TAs are available for office hours to help you. This lab is due on Friday, so if you haven't already done it, go and take a look at it and let me know if you, let me or the TAs know if you have questions. Now, continuing on to the material. I first taught this class in winter 2020, and it was summer in Antarctica then. And in an Argentinian base, Esperanza base, which I briefly mentioned before, that's actually a base at which children have been born because there sometimes are families that stay there for several years. Esperanza base is in the peninsula, which is the northernmost part of the continent. It is also the part of the continent that is most surrounded by the ocean, and it is warming the fastest. And on February 6th, 2020, the air temperature was measured at 18.3 degrees Celsius, and that is about 64.94 degrees Fahrenheit. A cool day here, but just balmy and warm by Antarctic standards. And this beat the previous record of 17.5 degrees Celsius taken in March 2015, only 5 years earlier. So we are seeing temperature records be beaten in a matter of a few years. The temperatures are climbing, especially in the Antarctic Peninsula. And what's funny to me is that when I went back to make some edits to these slides in winter 2021, last quarter, I realized that actually mere days after I'd come across this article and after some of my students had pointed out to me, the record was beaten. Because at a Brazilian station, Ferraz Station, which is also in the peninsula, as you can see, they recorded a temperature of 20.75 degrees Celsius or 69.3 degrees Fahrenheit on February 9th of 2020. Antarctica is getting warmer, and it's getting warmer fast. And Antarctica is getting warmer because of climate change induced largely by human activities, and especially so by the burning of fossil fuels. Now, speaking of fossil fuels, there is coal in Antarctica. It is not being extracted presently. This is coal that formed as well a fossil. We have fossils of ferns from Antarctica from past times, including from the Carboniferous and early Permian period, when Antarctica was covered by these coal swamps of non-flowering plants. Club mosses, horsetails, which you sometimes see growing in stream beds, and then ferns and conifers. These plants would grow extensively and then they would die and the plant matter would get buried. And there was so much plant matter accumulating that the pressure would bury and start to concentrate the hydrocarbons before they could really get decomposed by microorganisms. And so the pressure of the plants and the overlying rocks converted these coal swamps into coal. And in Antarctica, that coal is now buried under younger rocks as well as ice sheets. But sometimes coal in Antarctica is exposed by landslides or found in little bits of glacial erratics. And coal is one of the few potentially economically extractable resources presently known from Antarctica. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next lecture when I talk about the Antarctic Treaty and how the treaty was in part put in place to ban mineral and fossil fuel extraction. The coal deposits from Antarctica are largely from the Transantarctic Mountains, with a couple of possible locations mapped in the peninsula as well. There's probably coal elsewhere also because coal was just formed everywhere. We have it in West Virginia, we have it in China, we have it in Russia, we have it in Antarctica because worldwide, the Carboniferous and the early Permian were dominated by these coal swamps. But a lot of it's covered by ice now. The bits that have been mapped are in the relatively exposed rocks of the peninsula and then in the Transantarctic Mountains. And the coal is not being extracted and it's not contributing to global warming. So the fossil fuels in Antarctica are not being extracted. Antarctica has largely remained unchanged in the sense that the carbon cycle has been largely unbroken. The carbon cycle traps hydrocarbons underground and locks them up in the form of fossil fuels until humans remove them. In Antarctica, the coal has not been removed, but elsewhere in the world, coal being removed is being burned, and the burning of that coal is contributing to climate change, and that is affecting Antarctica. And the reason I bring this up is because no matter how much of a wilderness you keep Antarctica, what happens in one part of the world is going to have a pretty significant effect on the rest of the world, at least down the line or somewhat. And one of the climate articles I assigned talks about that, how warming air temperatures causing cyclones in the Pacific are influencing warmer air temperatures in the interior of Antarctica, which you would think wouldn't have much to do with warming temperatures in the South Pacific. And we're going to focus on these specific effects of climate change on a very generalized continent-wide scale. But I will say that the effects of climate change are quite complex and they tend to vary in different parts of the continent. As a whole, air temperatures have risen, as I spoke about with the air temperatures measured at the bases in the peninsula. Ocean temperatures have also risen. Winds have gotten stronger, sea ice has melted, and the ice shelves have gotten less stable. To some degree, as a consequence of the loss of sea ice, krill populations have dropped, and this has created a ripple effect among the living organisms at higher trophic levels that depend on the krill, like the fish that feed on the krill and the penguins and seals that eat those fish. Whatever happens to the bottom of the food chain is going to affect organisms up the food chain. The same way that if crops fail, we have food shortages. And when the asteroid hit the Earth, that caused a plant die-off, and that caused a dinosaur die-off because the dinosaurs didn't have any food anymore. So using a combination of data from ice boreholes as well as from more recent records taken at weather stations, we have a pretty good idea of what the air temperatures in Antarctica have been like over the past few hundreds of thousands of years. And we can tell that they've been getting warmer in the past couple of centuries than they have been in quite a while. For example, this shows you using satellite data and boreholes that air temperatures have gone up really big time in the past couple of decades. And the warming rates have also gone up quite a bit. This is especially true in West Antarctica because the West Antarctica is in general farther north and more surrounded by oceans, which have absorbed a lot of the heat from global warming and more vulnerable to climate change. In the part of West Antarctica that's closer to the South Pole, it is warming at a rate of 0.47 degrees Celsius per decade. In the peninsula, it is warming at a rate of 0.58 degrees per decade. These are a lot faster than the global average. Globally, average air temperatures are going up by 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade. West Antarctica is one of the fastest warming places on Earth, and this is going to have significant consequences down the line for the landscape and ecosystems of Antarctica. This has the potential, and it already seems to be doing so, to reduce sea ice and to also potentially cause more melting of glaciers on land and expose more rock, potentially opening up Antarctica to colonization by invasive plant species. Now, speaking of ocean temperatures, the oceans have gotten a lot warmer. And the top 3,000 meters of the Southern Ocean have warmed by 1 degree Celsius over the last 80 years. That's less than the air temperature, and that might not seem so dramatic, but remember that water has a higher heat capacity than air. You can pump a lot more energy into water and see the temperature actually rise not very much than air. Heat capacity, so temperature is basically how much kinetic energy, temperature is you can put the same amount of energy into two different substances and the temperature will go up different amounts. 500 joules put into air will cause a much higher temperature change than 500 joules put into water. So even a pretty minuscule seeming change in the numbers of degrees Celsius that the water is pretty alarming. And So 1 degree Celsius over 80 years in the Southern Ocean is actually a pretty dramatic change, considering the high heat capacity of water. And warming water has a number of consequences. It contributes to runaway ocean acidification because warm water dissolves less gaseous carbon dioxide than does cold water, which means that more of the CO2 dissolved in the ocean converts to carbonic acid, and that causes ocean acidification and makes it harder for foraminifera and other phytoplankton and for shell-bearing snails and corals to precipitate their carbonate shells. In addition, with the water being less cold, this is causing less Antarctic bottom water to form. Warmer water is less dense and less likely to sink. And if there's less Antarctic bottom water forming, this has potentially dire consequences for thermohaline circulation. And that is linked to the overall abundance of oxygen and nutrients throughout the world oceans, because Antarctic bottom water, remember, carries both of those to the deep ocean and spreads them out throughout the world's oceans. And this has some potentially dire consequences for ecosystems, not just in Antarctica, but elsewhere. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that less sea ice is forming. With the water being warmer, the sea ice that forms is going to be spottier and thin, if any forms at all. And it also is causing the ice shelves, as well as outlet and tidewater glaciers, to melt faster. The ice shelves and tidewater glaciers are in contact with the ocean, and the increased heat in the liquid water gets transferred to the glaciers, and that causes them to melt faster and start to retreat. I also mentioned the winds being stronger. And if you thought Antarctica couldn't get any windier, apparently it can. Warmer oceans have more energy, and outside of Antarctica, you've heard about global warming being linked to stronger hurricanes because the ocean has more heat in it, more energy to power those hurricanes. So in Antarctica, with the water being warmer, we haven't had hurricanes per se, but we have had overall warmer sea temperatures in winter, driving stormier weather. The heat from the ocean gets transferred to the air, and that drives stronger winds. And the summers being warmer has also caused more storms as well. The winds around Antarctica have gotten about 15 to 20% stronger in the past 25 to 30 years. And so stronger winds in Antarctica are occurring as a result of global warming. And this is just a sign of how much chaos has been caused by global warming. It's not necessarily the thing you think of instantly, but remember hurricanes. We have more hurricanes because of global warming, because of the heat added to because of the energy in the water, and more energy in the Southern Ocean means stronger storms in Antarctica. Now, I talked about sea ice. And in Antarctica, the effects of global warming on sea ice have not been quite as uniform as in the Arctic. In the Arctic, sea ice is just vanishing. It's disappearing rapidly across the ocean, and there's a good chance the North Pole will have open water within my lifetime, which is weird to think about. In part because Antarctica's various seas are surrounded by continents to different degrees and affected by the Antarctic circumpolar current in different ways, the effects of global warming on sea ice have not been uniform in Antarctica. The sea ice in the Ross Sea has been increasing, and it has also been increasing in parts of the Weddell Sea and in the part of Antarctica lying south of the Indian Ocean. Of course, the article that I had you read indicates that the Weddell Sea is starting to lose ice also, so some of these trends appear to kind of be flukes, and it appears that Antarctica is starting to suffer extensive sea ice loss as well. And sea ice extent has really been dropping in the Bellingshausen and the Amundsen Seas near West Antarctica. So the takeaway that I'm getting from this is that sea ice has really started to melt the most in the areas near West Antarctica, and now we're starting to see the other seas be affected as well. And the loss of sea ice around Antarctica has some pretty devastating effects. For one thing, when the sea ice melts and exposes the dark-colored ocean water, the open ocean water has lower albedo. It absorbs more solar radiation than does the light-colored sea ice. Sea ice is a good reflector of radiation and helps keep the planet cool. Ocean water absorbs more solar radiation. And so as global warming causes the sea ice to melt, the white sea ice is replaced by dark ocean water, and thus the ocean water absorbs even more solar radiation and gets even warmer, creating a positive feedback loop. Also, remember that ecologically, sea ice is really important for algae and krill. Algae and krill both live on sea ice during the winter. And with the drop in sea ice, especially in West Antarctica, we have seen a dramatic drop in the population of krill, as well as phytoplankton. An interesting consequence is that open water organisms like salp, which it's a tunicate or a sea squirt, funnily enough, this is, of all the invertebrates or organisms that don't have a skeleton, this is basically our closest cousin. In its larval form, this looks like a tadpole, and it has a notochord, like the cord that runs through our spines. But the salp are an open water dwelling sea squirt that are thriving now because the ocean is becoming, well, more open and less frozen over. A consequence of this is that very few organisms actually eat salp. It's kind of like how almost rats and other invasive species are thriving in the wake of human-caused changes. Salp are not introduced by people. They lived in Antarctica already, but they're spreading, and the ecosystem is being much more heavily dominated by salp than by krill. And that's a problem in terms of what the current ecological composition is like. Antarctica's current marine ecosystem relies heavily on abundant krill to feed the seals, or to feed the fish and the whales and seals that feed directly on it, as well as on the penguins that feed on the fish, and the orcas and leopard seals that feed on the fish and on the penguins and on the other seals. So up the food chain, the other organisms start to suffer. The drop in krill has been linked to the decreases in the number of breeding pairs of penguin populations, because penguins eat fish and squid that rely on krill. And it seems that a lot of penguin species are breeding less because they can't get as much food to guarantee the survival of their offspring. And this is a good indicator. This is a good example of a ripple effect. What happens at the bottom of the food chain is going to really affect what's higher up on the food chain. And us as humans have to be concerned about this as well, because globally, as for example, the availability of farmland changes and likely decreases as a result of spreading deserts from global warming, then we have less food available to feed us, and that has the potential to create massive loss of life, as well as a lot of political instability and a refugee crisis, the crisis that we're already starting to see unfold with climate refugees, people who can't live where they've been because of rising sea levels, or because of deserts spreading, or because of war breaking out as a result of all these things. And I mentioned invasive species before. Salp aren't precisely invasive because they were present already, but we're seeing some other Antarctic species also change ranges, and then some completely invasive species start to show up in Antarctica. So, for example, Gentoo penguins are one type of penguin that breed in open water. They normally only breed and spend lots of time on the subantarctic islands, but we are starting to observe them a lot more in Antarctica proper, as Antarctica proper, including the peninsula, is getting warmer. And so Gentoo penguins have been spotted feeding a lot farther south than they used to. Conversely, the Adelie penguins, which are a species that relies very heavily on the sea ice for their feeding and breeding cycle, they've retreated even farther south, and that poses the risk that their habitat will completely disappear as Antarctica gets warmer. The same way that as global warming presses on, alpine habitats go higher and higher up, like the cool pine mountain forests get higher and higher up, until you get to a point where there isn't any more space for them anymore. The mountain is too warm that even on the top, you don't get these alpine communities. You kind of get the same thing going south. Potentially, Antarctica could get warm enough that there isn't enough sea ice for Adelie penguins to survive at all, which is devastating. Meanwhile, the two native plants on the shores of Antarctica are seeing their ranges expand. Antarctic hairgrass and pearlwort are growing in places where they have not been documented before. Now, Antarctica usually doesn't have that much of an issue with invasive species because most exotic species cannot survive in Antarctica. But we're starting to see invasive species show up. They've seen king crabs in Antarctic waters. They've also seen invasive mussels. And this is raising concerns that more invasive species will start to colonize Antarctica and start to outcompete the very specialized native Antarctic ocean fauna. And this is less maybe of a concern on land because the land isn't really, it doesn't support much life to begin with. But on land, there's much more of a potential for airborne insects and plant spores and seeds to start getting established on Antarctica, species that haven't been seen there before. And it's an open question as to whether this is really primary succession, because there weren't really plants growing there before, or whether it's an invasive species. But the point is that it really shouldn't be one species, aka humans, driving the changes that bring about these changes in habitat distribution. Climate is going to change, yes, but it's kind of disturbing when one species does something that causes climate to change this quickly and causes it to change outside of cycles caused by subduction and Milankovitch cycles and the like. Now, as for melting sea ice doesn't actually contribute directly to sea level rise, because the volume of water that is displaced as ice is about the same as the water released when they melt. And the same is true of the ice shelves and the icebergs that break off from ice shelves. The ice is already floating on the ocean and displacing some seawater, so whatever seawater is displaced will be balanced out by whatever water is released when they melt. However, when sea ice and ice shelves are lost, this causes habitat loss for krill and for algae, and it also causes effects on the populations of the penguins and seals that live on top of them, as well as for species like polar bears in the Arctic. Not to mention, the loss of ice means that the polar regions have lower albedo. There's more rock exposed and more open ocean exposed, and those surfaces are darker colored and they absorb a lot more radiation than the ice. Now, what really causes sea level rise is the melting of glaciers on land, because it is the accumulation of those glaciers on land that actually causes sea level to be lower now than it would be outside of an ice age. If you remember during the Cretaceous period, if you look at a map from the Cretaceous period when there was no ice on Earth, essentially, you have these interior seaways flooding low-lying regions of North America and Europe. A lot of Europe is just a bunch of islands. It's covered all in water. And the ice in the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets has, in many cases, not been in the ocean for thousands of years. So if the ice sheets start to melt, then that carries the risk that sea level is going to rise. And it is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet in particular that is of concern for sea level rise, but the West Antarctic ice sheet is not doing so well either, unfortunately. The West Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass, and that is contributing to sea level rise. It's not quite as strong a contributor to sea level rise as the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, but it's still definitely concerning. And we're seeing a loss of about like 10 to 14 centimeters of liquid water per year in Antarctica, which is a lot when it piles up. East Antarctica has a more stable ice sheet. The interesting thing is that in East Antarctica, changes in global climate patterns have actually resulted in more precipitation around the South Pole, which is causing the eastern sheet to increase in mass. However, there is still a worrying amount of melting occurring along the coasts, with the oceans getting warmer. Excuse me. A lot of our studies that have let us determine how fast the ice sheets are melting comes from satellites. And in 2018, there was a study involving a satellite being launched that had an altimeter, which is a device that measures altitude and measures how high different portions of the ice sheet are. And as you can see, we have some really scary losses of ice in West Antarctica. The satellite data helps us understand how losses of ice in one part of the ice sheet might affect the ice sheet further inland, because what happens on the coast is going to affect what happens inland because of the way the glaciers are connected. So in Antarctica, the effects of climate change haven't been quite as obviously devastating as the Arctic so far, but it's going to get worse. And most scientists are cautioning that it's already starting to get worse, and we're already starting to see that. we really don't know what kind of territory we're heading into. And by causing a faster release of CO2 back into the atmosphere than at any time in geologic history, except for possibly during the Permian extinction, we are running what is known as an uncontrolled experiment on Earth, in that we are doing something that we don't really know what the long-term consequences are going to be. I mean, we can make some guesses, but we don't really know just how out of control it's going to get. And we don't have a stable planet to retreat to or compare it to. We are doing something unprecedented, with the possible exception of the Permian extinction, which is not something we should try to replicate, because remember that 96% of all marine life died off as a result of that. This is dangerous, needless to say. And we are essentially playing a form of, we're essentially playing Russian roulette with the planet by society continuing to not really do anything about climate change. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the articles and the video clip I assigned you. Article 1 reports on sea ice loss and gives you a sense of how much is actually disappearing. And about a third of the average winter cover in the Weddell Sea, as reported in this article, had been lost, which is alarming. The article also talks about how polynyas have formed more frequently and how they've been larger and longer lived. Polynyas, remember, are gaps in the ice, and we're getting more and more gaps in the ice as a result of the loss of sea level, the loss of sea ice, excuse me, which indicates that we're having more open water and less ice-covered water. And it's also interesting to read about how they use satellites to make observations and collect data. Article 2 is a good choice for assignment number 2 if you're looking for ideas or looking for an example of what type of article to use. And it's a bit more technical, but they're talking about warming air temperatures and studying how stronger cyclones in the western tropical Pacific are causing more warm air to reach the Antarctic interior. And it's a good example of how far away effects of climate change still affect Antarctica. And for the Frozen Planet clip, it's worth returning to your notes from the first clip that we watched earlier in the term to think about how the ecosystems and the landscapes being shown are being affected. Melting glaciers, disrupted food chains, and if you have time, it is worth going over the parts related to the Arctic, because you can think about why the Arctic might be warming faster, in part because it's covered by oceans versus land, and how that's really badly affecting the indigenous people of the Arctic, affecting their ability to hunt, affecting where they can safely live, rising sea levels, making their villages uninhabitable. And that's not directly applicable to Antarctica because there's no indigenous population there, but it highlights the risks that climate change has for people worldwide, and particularly for indigenous communities. And it also talks about ice cores and the Antarctic climate record. And it's also worth considering how this episode was not aired in the United States on network TV or put on Amazon to stream, because there are political concerns about climate change, and that there's a lot of people in power in this country that continue to deny the reality and the severity and the seriousness of anthropogenic climate change. It really shouldn't be this controversial at this point, but here we are. And on that cheerful note, we'll conclude the course next week on Monday, May 24th, where I'll record the final lecture on modern Antarctica and a conclusion to the course. And then I'll be doing a review of the pre-midterm material that might show up on the final on Wednesday, May 26th. So I will see you next week. Have a good rest of your week and a good weekend, and email me if you have questions. And you all have a good night.